apologize to everybody for being late, but I'm on the Rules Committee, and we just met to provide a rule to keep the government from prevent the government from shutting down. So I hope that was worth a little 10-minute delay. Anyway, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to this very important hearing on international financial institutions and human rights. And I want to thank the Commission staff for their work in putting this event together. I am pleased to welcome all of our witnesses and recognize your hard work on these important issues. Some of you have traveled long distances to be here, and you are bringing deep expertise and on-the-ground experience from 3 regions, Europe, Africa, and Latin America, to share with us today, and I'm grateful for all of your efforts. I would like to extend a very special welcome to the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Professor Philip Alston. Professor Alston is an internationally known expert on human rights and international law who has served the UN in various capacities since the 1980s. I know him as a strong advocate for economic and social rights, including the right to food that is so important for ending hunger, and we are honored by his presence here today. Every morning I get up and I listen to the news, and often it's bad. Lately it seems like that we are constantly confronted with new or worsening human rights situations and crises. Some, like Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Burma, are due to armed conflict or internal unrest or a combination of the two. But others are due to ongoing, long-standing situations in which large numbers of people are relegated to the margins of national life and living in conditions that are wholly inconsistent with human dignity. I'm talking about poverty. Which in spite of some progress in recent decades, still affects nearly half, 44%, of the world's 7.3 billion people. In 2011, more than 1 billion people were living on less than $1.25 per day, the threshold for extreme poverty. Another 2.2 billion lived on less than $2 a day, the average poverty line in developing countries. These are mind-boggling numbers. But poverty is not merely about a lack of income. It is also about not being able to access even minimum levels of food, water, education, health care, and housing. Poverty is about not having work or an adequate standard of living, conditions that are indispensable for the full development of one's being, as is recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Or, let me put it another way, not having work that helps provide an adequate standard of living, because we all know that the poor work very, very, very hard every day, but still remain mired in desperate circumstances. So the figures that I just cited are from the World Bank, an international financial institution whose goals include ending extreme poverty. The World Bank Group, which works to achieve those goals through development programs and projects. It is a development agency, not the only one, but certainly one of the most important in terms of the amount of resources it expends each year and the scale of funded projects. If you take a look at the bank's annual World Development Report, you will find information on the state of poverty worldwide defined by income level. You will also find information on a range of other issues that the bank has identified as key for achieving development, gender equality, child labor, rule of law, ending corruption, fostering good governance, and ending discrimination against indigenous peoples, amongst others. When the bank talks about these issues, it links them to human rights, which is appropriate. As early as 1998, the World Bank acknowledged that creating the conditions for attainment of human rights is a central and irreducible goal of development, and that the world now accepts that sustainable development is impossible without human rights. Yet, for a variety of historical reasons, the bank has long resisted explicitly incorporating human rights into its policies and practices at the operational level. And this is the topic we're here today to explore. On one hand, the failure to incorporate human rights standards in the design, implementation, and evaluation of bank projects has generated a number of adverse effects at the local level, such as land grabs, mass evictions, and forced displacement that obviously could have been prevented. We will hear testimony today about 3 such cases in Kosovo, Ethiopia, and Peru, in which the people who are supposed to be helped by a development initiative end up being harmed. A country's own formal commitment to protect its people's rights, even when it exists, is not enough in the face of the temptation of millions of dollars in international investment. But if the bank's own operating standards incorporated rights protections, these outcomes could be avoided. On the other hand, by not incorporating human rights, the bank is foregoing guidance that could help ensure that its projects and programs contribute as effectively as possible to improving the conditions of human dignity, because that is the real goal of development. Increasing income is a means to that end, not the end itself. The World Bank is not the only international financial institution, nor the only development agency, but it is arguably among the most influential. It is a major source of funding and technical assistance for developing countries, and it has contributed to alleviating many crises around the world. Its policies and practices exert considerable influence. The U.S. Congress has played and continues to play an important role vis-a-vis the World Bank and other international financial institutions. U.S. contributions to the bank require legislation. Congress oversees U.S. participation in the bank. The U.S. commercial interests engage with the bank. So I believe the Congress is well positioned to encourage the bank to incorporate human rights into its operational policies and practices, which in turn would have a positive effect on the entire development field. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks the bad news that confronts us on a daily basis. I will close by repeating something I've been saying all year. As a member of Congress, I'm looking not just to criticize, but to identify new and creative ways to contribute to improving the human rights situation around the world. We need to understand what's gone wrong in the past and what is still going wrong today. But we especially need to focus on what to do to change things for the better future. So I very much look forward to hearing the testimonies today, and especially the recommendations for what needs to change and how the U.S. Congress can support that change. So I'm very pleased to welcome the members of our first panel who will present case studies of the negative consequences of development projects funded by the World Bank in partnership with other international financial institutions. Mr. Obang Metho, am I pronouncing that? Yeah, like Executive Director, Solidarity Movement for a New Ethiopia. Mr. Milton Sanchez, General Secretary, the Interinstitutional Platform of Selindin. Mr. Nazir Sinani, am I saying that? I'm from Massachusetts. My English is bad. So, I mean, I just wanted to, Safeguards Coordinator and Climate Change Coordinator, Bank Information Center. I thank you for your presence today. I would like to formally, I would like to formally submit the written testimonies of all the witnesses in this hearing. Mr. Metho, why don't we begin with you? And just make sure your green light is on here.
Yeah, it's on now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving us this opportunity to talk about these issues. That's very, very critical. I, would like my statement to be put on a record. This is a very crucial issue that really we are talking about today. The financial institutions, especially the World Banks, was set up to help those who are the most vulnerable people, or to help the peoples, not to hurt or to harm the peoples. The example that I'm going to give today, or the talk, I am not here as an expert, but I'm here as a witness, especially speaking on behalf of the Ethiopian people who have no voice. Being an indigenous from Ethiopia, not alone, I could say that I could speak on behalf of all Ethiopian. Organizations that I run is a social justice of diverse Ethiopian. And it's a social justice that based on principles. And that principle is to have an Ethiopia where our humanity come before anything else. An Ethiopia that where justice and the well-being of Ethiopians are all protected. In other words, no one will be free until we are all free. With that in mind, the example that I'm going to use is start almost, I would say that in 2008. In 2008, the Ethiopian government evicted a local people from their land. I think that you mentioned on your statements. In around 2008, there were food shortage around the world, and there were people who were protesting, looking, for food. And some of the investors realized that investing in food will be the most needed. And so what happened was they realized that we have almost, in the next few years, we'll have 9 billion people, and these people need food to be fed. And they went looking for a more fertile land. And where do you find the lands? Africa will become one of the key places. And so when they did that, some of this land that the investor won was not a land that nobody lived in. It's a land that had been occupied by the indigenous people who live in that place. And this is where the case of Ethiopia come in. The Gambela region of southwest of Ethiopia, where I come from, it's a very most fertile area. By that time, the Ethiopian government decided that they were to remove the people by what they call villagization, moving the people from the place that where they've been living for generations and to some place that where they were told that you are here on your own. Keeping in mind that you said earlier, the image of Ethiopia, what we know is starvation, no food, lack of food. That's what Ethiopian has been known. It's not because Ethiopians don't have a fertile land to feed themselves. Ethiopians don't have the system that will be able to sustain to feed their own peoples. So these Ethiopians that were evicted from the land, these was not people who depend on food aid. These was people that who use the land to feed their families. I'm one example of those. I was not raised by the income that had been brought from the office. I was raised from the income that come from the land. To me, the land is my identity, my culture, my value. And when you take a land away from me, then you take away my future, my livelihood. To me, it's not a land grab, it is a life grab. So when the local people were evicted from Gambela regions in southwest of Ethiopia, at that time there was a study that which was done with Auckland Institute. What we found was 78% of the land grabber are domestic local people, 22 almost that from abroad. And based on that, the Human Rights Watch and other, when they studied, they found that the local people who had been displaced from their land, especially the indigenous Anuak people, was evicted by the money that which was given by the World Bank, PBS. And then by that time, the local Anuak that, requested, and thanks to the Congress that, a few years back, the Congress has introduced and to make sure that the World Bank is accountable to have inspection panels where the World Bank will be able to investigate what's going on with themselves. So these local people then, submit an appeals. And thanks to those appeal committee and the inspection panel went to Ethiopia. They interviewed the local people. Those Anuak who were, left Ethiopia, in Kenya, in South Sudan, they went there. And then the report came out. According to the report, the World Bank has violated their law. Even Dr. Kim admitted that. And when someone violates the law, there's supposed to be reinforcement to that law. If there's no reinforcement to law, it's meaningless. The World Bank admitted. Just last month, Dr. Kim gave another money, $350 million to Ethiopia. Why? Because what I see now is Ethiopia, for most of you who don't know, it's a country that's been considered by Obama administration, Bush administration, as a ally on war on terror. The Ethiopian liberty, the Ethiopian futures have been ignored because for the security. As a result, the Ethiopians are suffering. So because of that, the World Banks pretty much can do whatever they want. And now that's where we come in. The Congress, if the World Banks cannot live up to their own violations, their own laws, then the Congress has to go up to do that. And this is why we are coming here to tell the Congress. We had people who have been, harmed by the money that which has been given by the World Bank the money that World Bank got by being approved by the Congress. And this money, no one has been made accountable. Transparency, accountability is non-existent. So in other words, in Ethiopia, this is a country that where they passed a law, Charity Proclamation Bill. In Ethiopia, civil society is non-existent. Journalists have been put in jail. The bloggers have been put in jail. This is a country that where it is against the law for women's rights, child rights, disabled rights, reconciliation, the value, the principle that Americans founded on. And then this is a country that passed a law, anti-terror laws. All the Ethiopian political dissents are being put in jail. The journalists have been put in jail for writing, just simply. Just because they are a friend or alliance on war on terror, they've been allowed to get away with it. So now let's come to this. If in Ethiopia, we don't have a rule of law, the people in Ethiopia are looking for somebody else to speak for them. And if the World Bank cannot speak up for those peoples, where else do these people go to? I don't lose hope. Because again, in this country we live in, the World Banks get portion of money from the US, and they cannot get it without approval from the Congress. So this is where I come in coming to my conclusion remark. The World Bank has failed miserably. The money that's supposed to help the people harm the peoples. The World Bank is supposed to be the adult in the room to tell the kids. But in other words, they did not live up to their responsibility. I want to hint my remark with this. We already know the World Banks did not live. There's no compensation. Those local people who are being evicted, even though it's been proved, they did not do anything. What I'm hoping from the Congress, to include an appropriation committee, to making sure that if the World Bank money is to go and harm the people, maybe it's not worth it giving it in the first place. At the end of the day, I am not against helping the poor peoples, but I'm against ignoring the suffering of the peoples. In a case, if the World Bank don't leave that, what makes them different than Ethiopian government that has a constitution, they don't follow the constitution? Ethiopian that claim that they are democratic when they win election 100%. Ethiopian which say that there's rule of law when anyone been put in jail without any trial. What's the difference if the rhetorics of Ethiopian government claiming that they are democratic, winning 100%? There's no civil societies. Rule of law doesn't exist. Journalists are being accused of being a terrorist because journalists usually terrorists are known by harming people, but not by fans. So in this mind, I just want to say that yes, it has been proved without reasonable doubt. It has been proved, but the World Bank has lived up to that. And I hope that the Congress will live up to their responsibility. At the end of the day, our humanity has no boundaries. The suffering that which is being done by those governments should not get away with it because they are alliance on war on terror. US can have it both ways. To have a government that respected the Ethiopian people, have the rule of law, and have a government that really can protect the national interest of the US. In the long run, all of us have responsibility for the well-being of those who are vulnerable, who cannot speak for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sanchez?
Bien, muy buenas tardes. Agradezco esta oportunidad que nos brindan para poder presentar nuestro caso. Mi nombre es Milton Sánchez Cubas, yo vengo de una provincia que se llama Selendín, en el norte del Perú, en la región Cajamarca, y bueno, represento una organización que se llama Plataforma Interinstitucional Selendina, que está compuesto por más de 30 organizaciones entre ellos agricultores, ganaderos, sindicato de maestros, estudiantes, mujeres, jóvenes, ¿no?
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to present our case. My name is Milton Sanchez Cubas. I come from the province of Salindín, the region of Cajamarca in the north of Peru. I represent an organization called the Interinstitutional Platform of Salindín, which is a group of social organizations from city and rural areas, including farmers, those who raise livestock, women, youth, teachers' unions, etc.
Bueno, en esta oportunidad venimos a manifestar ante ustedes algunos problemas que nos están aquejando. Y esto tiene que ver con la ejecución de un proyecto minero que se llama Conga, que pretende ser ejecutado por una empresa denominada Yanacocha, de capitales norteamericanos, con una empresa llamada Newmont, con la IFC del Banco Mundial y también una empresa minera peruana.
What has brought me here today is to share with you some worries that are affecting our community. A company by the name of Minera Yanacocha, composed of Newmont Mining Corporation, the IFC of the World Bank, and a Peruvian company, is seeking to develop a mine called Conga.
Estos días hemos tenido algunas reuniones con la IFC, hemos tenido reuniones con también algunos directores del Banco Mundial y hemos venido a presentar un documento, es un informe que hemos elaborado conjuntamente con la provincia de Bambamarca, otra provincia que va a ser afectada, en donde demostramos bajo los estándares de la misma IFC que este proyecto minero Conga es inviable.
I've come to Washington, D.C. to meet with representatives from the IFC, with directors from the World Bank, and to share with them a report that we have written with a group of organizations from the provinces of Salindín and Hualgayoc that states that in light of the IFC's social and environmental sustainability standards, the project is inviable.
Me voy a ayudar de algunas imágenes que tenemos acá en la pantalla de cómo este proyecto minero nos va a impactar. Este proyecto está ubicado en una zona que es un ecosistema frágil, es muy sensible, pero es muy importante también para la vida y la subsistencia de las comunidades que vivimos alrededor.
I'm going to show you now some images which will help elucidate how this project will affect our lives. You can tell that the project is located in a very fragile, sensitive ecosystem that provides important ecological services for the neighboring communities and their subsistence and their lives.
Bueno, en esta zona es donde se pretende hacer el proyecto minero y en esta zona es donde nacen 5 ríos que abastecen de agua para la agricultura, la ganadería y para el consumo humano.
In this area, they intend on building the mining project, and it's the headwaters of 5 rivers that provide water to communities for agriculture, animal husbandry, and human consumption.
Bueno, el proyecto minero contempla destruir 4 lagunas para poder sacar oro, para poder sacar plata y para poder sacar también cobre.
The project intends on destroying 4 Andean mountain lakes so that it can extract gold and copper and silver.
Pero también este proyecto consiste en generar y en depositar millones de toneladas de relaves mineros tóxicos, así como también de desmontes que serían ubicados en estas zonas donde están nuestras lagunas y donde nacen nuestros ríos.
The project also entails the depositing of toxic mine tailings, millions of tons of toxic mine tailings and hard rock waste precisely in the area where our rivers form.
Este proyecto y estos desmontes y estos relaves mineros, según su propio estudio de impacto ambiental de la empresa minera, manifiesta que generaría drenajes ácidos de agua y lo que significaría los daños a la salud de las comunidades, pero también dar un tratamiento a perpetuidad de estas aguas.
The hard rock and liquid tailings waste, according to the mine's own environmental impact assessment, will produce acid water drainage in the region, which will contaminate the water and create impacts on people's health. And will require the treatment of water in perpetuity.
Este proyecto manifiesta que en reemplazo de nuestras fuentes naturales de agua, de nuestras lagunas, ellos van a construir reservorios, pero sin embargo nosotros le hemos manifestado y también hemos demostrado en informes técnicos que las lagunas que tienen miles de años no pueden ser reemplazadas por los reservorios, que es una construcción artificial y que tiene un tiempo de vida útil.
The company proposes to replace the lost water resources with man-made reservoirs. But we've manifested and we've stated through technical studies that you cannot replace a mountain lake, a natural mountain lake that's been around for thousands of years, with an artificial reservoir which has a limited lifespan.
Bueno, nuestras preocupaciones respecto a este proyecto minero no solo se basan en algunos o en varios informes técnicos que hemos realizado en Cajamarca, sino también se basa en lo que ha venido ocurriendo en Cajamarca.
Our concerns about this project are based not only in the technical studies that we've conducted, but also in our experience with the company and its mining projects in Cajamarca.
En Cajamarca ya son cerca de 23 años que vienen operando. Ofrecieron con estos proyectos mineros sacarnos de la pobreza, pero sin embargo ya han pasado muchos años de la extracción de minerales y nuestra región ahora, en vez de sacarnos de la pobreza, ha retrocedido. Ahora somos la región más pobre del país, es decir, el proyecto minero no nos sacó de la pobreza.
The mine, when it entered, promised that it would take us out of poverty, but in practice, the opposite has occurred. We've actually gone back, and we are now the poorest region in the country.
Y también nuestras preocupaciones se basan en los antecedentes de esta misma empresa, ¿no? Acá tenemos una fotografía de una de las lagunas en donde la empresa minera empezó a operar en los años 90, y es una imagen similar a las lagunas que nosotros tenemos en Selendín, y vamos a mostrar a continuación cómo ha quedado después de 23 años de minería en Cajamarca.
Our concerns are also based on the environmental impacts of the Yanacocha mine in Cajamarca. Here we are looking at a photograph of the Yanacocha Lake in 1992, and in the next slide we'll show you how the mine, what the lake looks like today.
Bueno, esto es lo que ha ocurrido en Cajamarca, y esto es lo que pretenden también realizar nuevamente en estas zonas en donde para nosotros, como repito, el agua es importante y es un medio prácticamente de subsistencia.
This is what has happened in Cajamarca, and particularly with the water, which is a resource that is important for our subsistence.
Bueno, la empresa minera Yanacocha, bueno, es una fotografía de la empresa minera por dentro, pero tenemos también que, a pesar de que la empresa minera ha destruido también lagunas, pero también ha destruido ríos. Y tenemos acá una imagen de cómo ahora nacen los ríos, ¿no? En tubos que salen de la mina, que antes nacían en las lagunas, que antes nacían en humedales, que antes nacían en ojos de agua, ¿no?
I've mentioned that the mine has destroyed our lakes, but it's also destroyed our rivers. And here is a photograph of a river that was once formed and born in the wetlands and in the mountain lakes, and then now it's born in the pipelines that come from the mine.
Numerosos estudios también en Cajamarca están demostrando que el agua de los ríos tiene metales pesados sobre los límites máximos permisibles y principalmente es el arsénico, es el plomo y es el cadmio que tiene precisamente esta agua, y eso se viene acumulando en el organismo de las comunidades que se ven afectadas por este problema.
There's also been diverse studies that have shown that the rivers are contaminated with heavy metals exceeding the maximum permissible limits, specifically lead, cadmium, and arsenic, and these chemicals enter the human body where they stay.
Estas aguas contaminadas de la empresa minera lo que ha venido ocasionando es también la muerte de los animales, producto de estas aguas contaminadas, como lo podemos apreciar en las imágenes.
These contaminated waters have resulted in the death of animals.
Nosotros hemos presentado nuestro rechazo a este proyecto por todos los daños que puede ocasionar, y lo hemos hecho de distintas maneras, en marchas, en manifestaciones, en documentos que hemos presentado al Banco Mundial, hemos presentado a la misma empresa y al gobierno también del Perú.
We have repeated our rejection of this project in numerous ways, including through demonstrations, marches, and letters that we've submitted to the World Bank, the Peruvian government, and the company Newmont.
Y lo que nosotros hemos recibido es prácticamente la militarización de nuestras comunidades, pero también la represión y también la criminalización de la protesta, ¿no?
And in response, we've received the militarization of our cities, the criminalization of our protests, the repression of our protests as well.
Yo mismo tengo más de 50 procesos judiciales que estamos afrontando, pero realmente no pueden demostrar los cargos sobre los que nos acusan.
I personally have been accused of crimes over 50 times, but in none of these cases have they been able to demonstrate any proof of any wrongdoing.
Pero lo que ha ocurrido también es el asesinato en las protestas de 5 compañeros nuestros, de 5 hermanos nuestros, uno de ellos de 16 años de edad.
But what is worse is for those of us who have been protesting and were killed during protests, including 5 individuals who were killed, one of which was a minor.
Y lo que pedimos en este caso también respecto a este proyecto minero, y de acuerdo a las conversaciones que hemos tenido con el IFC, es que incluso no tienen un estudio de este proyecto bajo los estándares que han elaborado la IFC del Banco Mundial.
And what we've been asking for in these meetings with the IFC is a review of the environmental impacts of the project in light of the performance standards of the IFC.
Eso a nosotros nos preocupa porque pretenden seguir adelante con el proyecto, pero sin embargo ellos no tienen ningún estudio de cómo esto va a impactar en nuestras comunidades.
And despite the fact that the company wants to proceed with this project, the IFC has not conducted any assessment of whether or not the project is in line with its own standards.
Y recientemente, el día de hoy, ella ha recibido una llamada de nuestros hermanos que están en Selendín, en donde nos manifiestan que la mina estaría tratando de entrar con su maquinaria ya a destruir estas lagunas, lo que significaría quizás un nuevo conflicto más fuerte de lo que ha venido ocurriendo, ¿no?
And just today, I received a phone call from my brothers in Selendín who reported that the mining company is seeking to encroach upon the lakes with their machinery with the intent of destroying the lakes, which could produce a social conflict even greater than what we've seen before.
Bueno, eso es lo que hemos querido manifestarles y agradezco por habernos escuchado.
This is what we came here to tell you, and I thank you for listening to us.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It's a great pleasure to be here and have this opportunity to address you and everyone else. Yeah. So I would also like to thank everyone involved with the work here at the Commission, the staff, for really doing extraordinary work in unearthing different stories that bring to light, the breach of basic human rights in World Bank related projects, but not just the World Bank, it's the other IFIs as well. And that way you help a lot in bringing the voice of those who don't have a voice at the global stage. And we're really grateful from that perspective. Mr. Chairman, I'm a Kosovo citizen. I was born in a small town called Podujev. I was raised there my whole life as well. And this town is just 15 miles away from a large lignite or a coal-based mine, which produces coal for Kosovo's two coal-based power plants that today produce 98% of all the electricity for the country. And the Kosovo government right now is trying to build a third coal-based power plant in the country to meet the country's future demand by basically adding more coal to the system. And in this, they're not alone. They have the support of the US government to start with, but also the support of the World Bank. What this project really involves is resettlement, and resettlement that has already happened, and I wouldn't even call it resettlement, it's forced evictions that has happened, and resettlement that is due to happen amongst the community that lives in a small village called Hade, but also other surrounding villages as well. I have been involved in this project myself ever since the mid-2000s, when I used to work for the Kosovo's energy company. And ever since 2011, I keep following this project from the civil society perspective, first as a civil society activist in Kosovo, and now I continue working for Bank Information Center here in Washington, D.C., and I'm highly involved with the project itself. Basically, this neighborhood that is being resettled is just a few miles away from where I grew up, and most of the people that live there are people that I personally know and have spent a lot of time in the last years in trying to raise my voice to help their voice in meeting the demands by the World Bank and the Kosovo government. A decision on a coal plant by the World Bank to support a coal plant in Kosovo by the World Bank hasn't happened yet. It's due to happen sometime next year, probably within 9 to 12 months from now. But the World Bank has been already involved in this project ever since 2004, and I'm going to explain the whole project from that perspective on how the World Bank got involved and how the whole resettlement and the communities have been affected so far and what is expected to happen in the next few months. So what really this project is about is producing more electricity for a country based on coal, and that means expanding the existing coal mines. It is expected that 7,000 people will be resettled in order to make way for the mine to be operationalized, basically. And this mine lies just 7 miles outside Kosovo's capital city, Pristina. So besides the effect that we will see on resettlement, the project itself will have many environmental and social impacts, not just on the communities around the mine itself, but also on the people living in the capital city itself. And the resettlement, as I said, has already happened. There's been forced evictions that have already happened in 2004 when there was, in the current existing mines, there was a landslide. So the governing bodies at that time, which was the UN administration and also our government itself, did enforce an emergency evacuation from the area, which saw many hundreds of people actually resettled from this place. And it was 22 families that refused to be evicted at that time from their houses, and that's when the government, together with the UN administration, sent in the bulldozers to remove people forcefully and basically just destroy their houses and put them in temporary houses. And all of this happened between May and June 2005, the forced evictions. While the World Bank in 2004, amid all this plan to resettle the people from Hade, basically, sent a two-man inspection team to Kosovo to see how the whole resettlement was handled. And this team at that time did recognize that the government's emergency procedure approach to involuntary resettlement was unacceptable and non-compliant with bank policies. It was in 2004 when they decided to provide technical assistance to Kosovo to basically develop legislation that was in line with bank policies on resettlement. It took them 9 years to produce two legislative pieces on this. One was a resettlement framework for the country, and another one was an appropriations law. And both of these policies are actually, to our surprise and shock, are not in line with the World Bank policy on resettlement itself. What happened out of this process is that they developed a resettlement framework, as I said, which is not the most commonly and doesn't constitute a good practice today in the world to start with, and it's not the most commonly used tool to resettle people in such large infrastructure projects. What is used is called the Resettlement Action Plan, basically, that is developed to deal with these kind of situations. And the difference between the two is that the framework only has 13 elements that deal with the protection of the people who will be resettled, whereas the Resettlement Action Plan has a total of 59 elements that are very specific and very more detailed and offer more protections for the resettled people. And basically in Kosovo, the World Bank invested for 9 years to produce two legislative pieces to produce legislation that's not in line with their policies itself, which is one of the first problems that we see in this project where the World Bank is involved. And goes without saying, these whole policies have resulted, in the situation where the Hade villages are today. And I will have to go back again to the year 2004 and 2005. That's where the UN administration and the Kosovo government declared the whole area around the mine a special interest zone, which meant that even for the people who hadn't been resettled, whatever they build from that time, they were first told that they would be resettled at a point to make way for the new mine. They were not told when that's going to happen. And the second thing, they were told whatever they build from that moment on, they wouldn't be compensated for because they've been already told that they had to settle from there. Mr. Chairman, now it's 2015. Those people still live in the same zone and under the same sort of restrictions. So whatever has happened in these last 10 years, they've been told that they won't be compensated for, but they're still being told that they will be resettled to make way for the mine, which hasn't happened yet. And that's a breach of human rights at a whole different level, where both the World Bank and the Kosovo government are involved. And that is a result directly of non-compliance with the World Bank policy itself on resettlement, because if that were to happen, there are strong principles in that policy right now that would help the communities a lot to deal with all the problems. In my testimony that I sent to be put on the record, there's a technical background paper that describes in detail what those principles are and how all of those implications come out of there. And the second problem that we see in this whole engagement of the bank in this project is that the Kosovo constitution does have a very strong language on protection of the human rights. The communities in Kosovo are dealing with the government through legal means there to deal with rights that are protected under the constitution in this project, but our problem with the World Bank is that it doesn't adhere in any way to the national laws on protection of the human rights when the bank gets involved. And that's the case also with the international rules as well on the protection of the human rights. So in all of this, the constitution has the rights in the country, but the government isn't delivering and the World Bank doesn't adhere at all. On the other side, there's World Bank policies that would protect to some extent the communities that are not being enforced in the country, which is a dual problem that we see. And all in all, that's resulting in the breach of basic rights in different fronts, starting from the right to housing, right to food, to water, and right to health as well, because of all the other environmental and social impacts this project is going to have. So understanding the situation and how everything is evolving, the World Bank hasn't decided yet to jump on to basically provide the money to build now the coal plant itself, although they're providing technical assistance still to the government to make everything happen so that they get to the project. I come here with three very straightforward recommendations to the US Congress and to you, Mr. Chairman, to help in this situation. And the first one is to ensure adequate protections and redress for displaced communities. So there are policies in place at the World Bank that deal with resettlement, so we want those to be enforced. We want that to see happen, and Kosovo isn't the only place where the World Bank has done a lot of harm in dealing with resettlement. Just this year, there was a big study that was published by investigative journalists, and which did point out that 3.4 million people had been affected by World Bank resettlement, and it remained unknown on how they're being treated, on how they were, what were sort of the compensation that they received. So it's a huge problem, and this problem itself was also then put into light by the internal watchdog of the World Bank itself that put a report on the matter. And the president of the World Bank did react with an action plan that is very insufficient and doesn't really address all the issues that have identified in all these problems. From that light, we do request from the US government to request from President Jim Kim of the bank and the US government a thorough plan to address the serious problems identified in the bank's resettlement practices to start with. And such a plan should ensure redress for harms already caused, as in Kosovo. And to this end, the bank must urgently address the ongoing unfair treatment of hundreds of families in Hade village in Kosovo. The second recommendation is very straightforward: respect for human rights. As I said, Kosovo government has strong policies on protection of the human rights, but the World Bank doesn't recognize no request from its borrowing countries the protection of the rights in its projects. The World Bank currently is reviewing its environmental and social policies, and this represents a huge opportunity for the US Congress to push the World Bank to include and address human rights in its policies, and that's our second request, that you reach out to them and demand that this happens at this time. And the third thing comes out of the principles on resettlement itself that the World Bank has in its own policies, and one of those principles is that whenever you get involved into a project, consider alternatives. Coal is a bad option for Kosovo because 98% of electricity is already produced by coal in that country, and that makes Kosovo the most polluted country in Europe right now because of burning all the fossil fuels. If you add more coal at this time, then you would lock Kosovo in burning coal for another 40 years, and that's going to continue having more impacts, environmental and social impacts on the Kosovar citizens. As I said, the support isn't coming just from the World Bank. The US government is also supportive of having a third coal plant in Kosovo. So from that perspective, we do demand and request that the US government drops this support, and we would be grateful if you could reach out to the US government and to President Jim Kim to look into alternatives for Kosovo and move away from coal and all the bad impacts that this project is going to have in my country. There are technical analyses that I have provided with my written testimony that provide what the options are to coal for the country, as well as a very detailed analysis on the resettlement issues that provide more insight into the matter. So I hope you'll look into that as you deal with this. So thank you very much for your attention.
So let me thank all three of you for your testimony, and let me say at the outset that this commission will work with you on the specifics in each of your countries. So the staff is happy to work with you to figure out how we can follow up, whether it's with our government or whether it's with the World Bank, on some of the specifics that you outlined in your testimony. Because, this is more than just about taking testimony. I mean, we want to be helpful and constructive to some of the issues that you outlined. So I just want to make sure that you know that that's a standing offer, and we're happy to follow up on all the things that you mentioned here today. And beepers that you're hearing in the background is a vote. So I'll have to leave a little while and come back. But just so you know, we're not being cleared out of this room. It's just there's a vote going on. You know, I'm trying to understand. I mean, when the World Bank gets involved in projects like the ones that you all outlined, when it comes to human rights and environmental protections and land rights, I mean, obviously there are the laws in your country, and I've yet to see a country that doesn't have a really good constitution and really nice sounding laws. Whether they enforce those laws and uphold those laws is always a challenge. But there's that avenue of trying to, you know, go through the courts or go through the process in a particular country. I guess I'm curious about the process for people like you and community advocates when it comes to dealing with the World Bank. I mean, how do you make these concerns known to the bank? How do they receive you? What is the process that you go through? Do they listen to you? That's, I guess.
Yes, you know, as I was saying, that an example of Ethiopia, for instance, there's a local people that who submit a complaint telling the World Bank that according to the World Bank, there's a law that, you know, if your money is being given to someone and that money does harm to the people, the World Banks, not the countries, but the World Bank have a responsibility.
Right.
And this is something which was really the work of Congress, you know, that put the World Bank to make the World Bank accountable. And so for that, then the World Bank did their own investigation, you know, the inspection funnels. So this investigation was not done by a human rights activist, was not done by anybody. The very same World Bank, part of their own body, investigated, and they found that there's a flaw. They found that, yes, that's why I say even Dr. Kim admitted there's hair into that. So where we have the problems, once that is admitted, there's supposed to be some kind of compensation or somehow to change it.
Right.
And that's where I come, where there's a problem. So they did not do that. Even for instance, one other thing which I find is that they say, you know, when the World Bank went to do investigation in Ethiopia, they hire a local gentleman, a pastor, to translate the language, Umotagwa. So Ethiopian government, when the report came out, they locked this man in jail, the man who translated for the World Bank. Even the World Bank did not have audacity to go in and make a statement. Dr. Kim did not even come out and make a statement for someone that would translate. This man came out to help them. And then when he was locked out, then we did not hear from the World Bank. So in other words, like someone saying that, you know what, I know how to swim, and when I jump at the rivers, I know you will be there. And then once you get in, they're not going to come to your aid. So in this case, that leave alone, the Ethiopian law is there, the Ethiopian government law is there, and that law is really not good for their own people. This is a country which is, for example, that's why I say that.
But just so we're clear, so the World Bank did an investigation.
Yes.
Right.
They found their finding.
And you agree with the findings?
Yes, the finding, then we agree
Right.
with it. Yes,
So-
the finding was good.
So nothing happened in the aftermath of those findings?
Exactly. They found the finding. The finding was that their money has done harm to the local indigenous people. The people they intend to help has ended up being actually hurt as a result of the money that the World Bank has given to the Ethiopian government. So in that case, then the World Bank is supposed to change the way things are and not give them money. But what they have done is give another more money to that country without any correcting anything at all. And that's where we have the problem with. So admitted that we have a problem and not doing anything about it, it's just.
And
No.
so when you approached the World Bank, or what was the response? They issued a report that you agree with the findings, but they've done nothing to do anything that will correct the situation. And they're giving more money, right?
Exactly.
So what is the response of the World Bank to
So
not acting on their report?
So the management was saying that, yes, you know, we agree. What's wrong with the, you know, we agree that, you know, our work or, you know, our money has done harm to the peoples. And then we will try to make sure that this thing doesn't happen again. That's what Dr. Kim said. But giving more money, what makes us think that that will not happen again? That's what I was saying, that you cannot just say that, yes, we will do it if you don't do
So
it.
what you're telling me in the case of Ethiopia, that you see nothing changed in how they deliver aid or how they condition aid?
Correct.
Okay. And in the case of Kosovo, I mean, I'm trying to understand, I mean, with all that's going on, with the coal plant, and I agree with you. I don't know why the hell we're building more coal plants. They should listen to the Pope's speech, climate change, but,
That's what I thought.
right, but the point is, like, I'm trying to say, like, you have these concerns, people are being displaced, no reparations, I mean, and what is the response of the bank
Yeah.
to that?
Like from my perspective, the problem is very systematic within the bank, because when the bank gets engaged with the country, they usually produce a strategy for that country. Today they call it with different names, but it's basically a 3-year strategy for the country where they look at the different projects they're going to invest in, and then they are supposed, according to their policies, to talk to the people that will be affected about if those projects are a good idea or a bad idea before they jump into a project itself. While in the Kosovo case, they just jumped in the middle of something that was going on without really thinking what they were doing. So there was no discussion whatsoever what any of the environmental and social impacts into all of that were.
But if I understood you correctly, they haven't yet decided as to whether or not they're going to fund the plant, right?
Not the plant itself, but they're given a lot of money as technical support to produce legislation that's enabling the coal plant to happen, basically. But so that's one of the problems. Like they jumped just in the middle of something that was going on, and when they did that, of course, they did talk to civil society, and they did hire survey companies to go and talk to the communities and get their thoughts and demands in place. But they've been put into paper, but nothing. They don't act on them. First, because they say there's still no projects from that perspective. There's still no coal project. And what they mean with that is before they can vote on a project, before they decide to give the money itself, they don't consider it a project already, despite being involved in technical support of all sorts in the country itself. And because of that, they basically say, whatever demands you bring to us at this point, we cannot meet them because we don't have a project that's going on. While the communities continue to suffer, like they've been put in this sort of prison where they've been told they will be resettled, but they're not being resettled, and whatever they've been building in the last 10 years, they're not going to be compensated because of something that was enforced 10 years ago. And none of that is being thought. So whatever, discussion happens between the community and the bank has gone
And
to a deaf ear.
how would you characterize the level of communication between the bank and civil society?
I think what the bank is doing is ticking boxes to make something happen. That's what sort of exercise they're doing in the country. And the only thing the communities have been able to do so far is reach out to the inspection panel, which is sort of the only means for them to get someone to investigate the matter. And they reached out twice to the panel in the last 4 years. The first one was in 2012, when the panel decided they couldn't investigate again on the same reason that there wasn't an official project in place, and they couldn't be, no policies were basically triggered. And the second complaint was just sent a month ago to the panel, and the panel finally decided that they would investigate because now they found a legal basis for that. So that basically remains the only element for them right now to use, and we'll see what outcome is going to get out of that.
And Mr. Sanchez, you mentioned the 5 people who died in the protest in July of 2012. Are there investigations underway into their deaths? And if so, what's the status of those investigations?
Primero, quería mencionar que nosotros también hemos presentado algunos memoriales al Banco Mundial en Lima, en sus oficinas de Lima, pero no hemos tenido respuesta aún.
First, I wanted to mention that we've presented formal letters to the World Bank in Lima, but to this date, we haven't received a response.
Hemos venido a sus oficinas acá en Washington para presentar también el informe y esperemos que en esta oportunidad ellos nos den una respuesta. Hemos venido a presentar un informe en donde demostramos que bajo sus propias normas de inversión, este proyecto violaría una serie de derechos humanos y por lo tanto el proyecto tendría que declararse inviable.
This visit here, we also went to the offices of the World Bank in Washington to present the report that we mentioned, in which we described the project and mentioned how the project would cause a series of human rights violations that, in light of its performance standards, make it unviable.
Y repito, también lo que nos preocupó es que la misma IFC no ha hecho una evaluación de este proyecto que está causando muchos conflictos sociales en nuestro país, no ha hecho una evaluación de qué daños podría venir por la intervención de la acción minera, ¿no?
And I would like to reiterate our concern that the IFC has not done an evaluation of the project in light of its standards, nor has it done an evaluation of the different risks that the project poses to our people while it's already causing serious harms.
Do you consider the IFC performance standards to be sufficiently strong from a human rights perspective? I mean, if they were fully adhered to, would they protect the community?
Sí, yo creo que han mejorado bastante de las normas que ellos tenían antes, ¿no? Aún así, yo creo que con estas que tienen actualmente el banco, o sea, podría declararse inviable este proyecto que quieren ejecutar.
First, I just want to mention that they've improved substantially from the years in which the mine first arrived. But even at their current state, they're sufficient that the mine or the IFC should be able to declare the project unviable.
Y respecto a las 5 personas que han sido asesinadas en Selendín, en Bambamarca, existe un proceso judicial en marcha. Existe también una pericia en donde han determinado la responsabilidad de la policía y del ejército en la muerte de las personas, pero sin embargo quieren archivar el caso en las cortes peruanas.
With respect to the 5 deaths, there does exist a criminal investigation, and there's been forensics that have shown that the bullets came from the police officers, and the police officers are responsible for the deaths. But despite of all of these facts, they're seeking to archive the criminal investigation.
Let me ask you all. I mean, your experience. I mean, look, I look at. We're all trying to make this better, right? So, in your experience, have you seen instances of good practices and practices supportive of human rights on the part of the bank that we should encourage and reinforce? Are there things that you can tell me that are going the way you would like them to go, or is there just a lot of room for improvement?
Mr. Chairman, as I was saying earlier before, that we are not against the banks. Right. The intention of the banks was for the good to help the people.
Right.
And if there's a practice that helping the people, we are very happy about it. But what we tend to see, in particular now these days, the word human right, the terminology human right, it's become a term that no one wants to use. Even the World Bank is leaning to that. Last year there was a meeting here with the World Bank where I find it that's appalling that because China has created these banks, now the World Bank is the safeguard. They want to minimize that. What kind of things we talk about now in the next few years, if it continue, they want to water it down. So when in some countries, like for instance in Ethiopia, a regime which is claimed to win an election 100%, a regime that civil society is non-existent. When you have a country like that, the only place where there's safeguard, where there's a human right, the only place where you can find a voice is from the financial institution like a World Bank or outsider, because it doesn't exist in that country. And when the World Banks ignore that, that's where I see to be having a bigger problem. So if they can do a practice that really helping the people, it is good. But sometimes they don't do that. And what we find is in case of example of Ethiopia, people talk about Ethiopia because economy booming. An example, there's no any countries where the corruption is rampant that can have developments. So in other words, a beggar cannot have a choice. So in this case, if the World Bank's doing the right thing and helping, we will definitely endorse that and support that. But when they are in cahoots with the regime that doesn't care for the well-being of the people, then we are really, this world we live in is much more serious and dangerous world.
Just very briefly, I think that some of the policies that the World Bank has, operational policies they have in force, have great principles that would ensure a lot of rights without referring to them as human rights, but they still would, enable a lot of things to happen in a good way. But the problem is just, enforcing them and following it in the case of Kosovo. As I said, like the resettlement policy, if it effectively, implemented in Kosovo, that would have resulted in something different from what we see today. And, just the failure to act on that, to enforce the policies is the problem itself, because the principles are there. And the problem that the World Bank sees itself in from that perspective is that they haven't found a way to really address all the problems that they themselves have identified. So the action plan to act on the problems they identify, it just, is missing. It's non-existent, and that's a problem itself. And as I said, there's always room to improve that, and that's what we're asking in the current review of their environmental and social policies. There's clear space for human rights to be referenced and put in the place that they deserve to be, and that's what they should do, and that would help a lot the communities in the future if it happens.
Bueno, a mí me parece que las normas, los estándares que han construido el banco me parece muy importante y realmente creemos que eso es un avance. Pero si estas normas o si estos estándares no los cumplen, realmente eso no serviría de nada, ¿no? Y a mí me parece que esto es lo que está ocurriendo en el caso del proyecto minero Conga.
There's a lot of good in these standards, and they're very important. And I really truly believe that there is much importance in these standards. But if the standards are not enforced, then they don't amount to anything. And I believe that is exactly what's happening with respect to the Conga project.
So I'm going to go vote, and so what I'm going to suggest is that during our brief little intermission here, that the commission staff we get reacquainted with all of you, and we figure out what our assignments are on the specific cases, in Ethiopia, Kosovo, or in Peru, and how we can be of assistance. And I'm also interested. You had some great suggestions on what the U.S. That it's not just the World Bank. The U.S. government is part of the issue, and we're happy to follow up on those things. And look, I hope you will stay in touch with us on concrete ways to make this better. I mean, look, we, the whole point of this is to try to alleviate some of the poverty and some of the inequality in the world, and help people who are struggling. And if it's not doing that, then we got to figure out how to do it better. And so I appreciate very much all of you being here. And we're going to take a temporary recess while I go and vote. And I get 2 quick votes. I'm hoping it will not take at all very long. So I apologize, but as I said, we're trying to keep the government open here. So.
some of them have been requested by people also as well. But the first is, there are all these reports that have been issued by the World Bank's internal officials. So that's the first one. There was an action plan that was introduced by the bank. Very disturbing. The technical background I sent, there's a lot of links with the request to see if there's stuff. We don't have an action plan from our perspective. No. I don't know if the site would use it. Like just in terms of, I think what would matter if the bank puts the action plan strengthened have been identified by the bank itself. That could be one, like that would help, that would push them, because they just sort of like produce that action plan which has like very, like, just for them to receive the push and see that there is, more for the country itself, right? Yeah. And for, and that request does relate to addresses. And that's, I attached the third annex, which is the complaint section that the norms are, but they're very straightforward. People want to be resettled and not to live any longer in this prison. Because right now, whatever they build or whatever they've done, they won't stop. While those that have been very forceful living, they live in temporary houses, same exact. So they, demand that they are resettled. All of that is very straightforward. Just enforce the resettlement policy. And I think in the second one, we'll hear from the World Bank is reviewing there's specific language. So that's and then the third one is more with regards to the government. Why would they third? Yeah, so I did provide a link to the Treasury letter, which is the US, that's a quote.
I'm taking the Congress puts water, Republicans don't need water anyway.
Construction of new efficiency fund and it was published, it was leaked actually in the New York Times, they published it, which was, because it's conflicting procedures. And stuff, and the demand there is just not a problem. And we have an alternative fund, which is called the which has been prepared by the University of Berkeley, and really specific about everybody has it. So the government has it, the World Bank has it. This is the third version of that alternative. The World Bank has it. just haven't paid attention. That's actually not an easy option for the Kosovo government. It's only in the World Bank pipeline.
Jolie?
It would have never happened. It's a US company. It's not yet building it. Negotiations are going on the contract. Let me know if I can help. There's a lot of links I've sent them. You can do directly as well. So chat is sometimes he forgets that. I mean, like I travel back and forth. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for inviting me.
Now you can have lunch.
We're all the same.
Now you can find out.
He's a good friend of mine. Actually, I know him very well. He's back now on his root business in New York, so he's not spending a lot of time.
Tell him I said hi.
Thank you.
So, what's this, this one? First one?
Yes, it's just Bob. And there's some questions, actually.
Right. Was that?
Yes, you were perfect, because I have a hard time. There's some questions here that we want to get here. I'll get them to you, but we want to get on the record.
Okay, all right, well, here again, I apologize for the break, but we now turn to our second panel. Once again, I welcome Professor Philip Alston, who was appointed United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights in June of 2014 by the Human Rights Council. Previously, he chaired the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and served as Special Advisor to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on the Millennium Development Goals. Professor Alston teaches at New York University School of Law and co-chairs the NYU Center for Human Rights and Global Justice, and I would like to formally submit his testimony into the hearing record, but we're thrilled to have you here, Professor, and welcome.
Yeah, okay. Many thanks, Congressman. I'm very grateful to you and to this commission for your efforts in holding these hearings, both this one and ones previously. I think the commission has a very important role to play, as does the Congress. I'm here in my capacity as UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. And I want to emphasize the extent to which the World Bank in this sort of setting is arguably the single most important international agency. Some people would question that characterization on the grounds that the 40 billion or more that the bank committed to borrowing countries in 2014 represents only a fraction of total private capital flows to developing countries from all multilateral and national development banks, bilateral donors and private investors. But not only is the elimination of poverty one of the bank's two central goals, its research is more voluminous and influential than that of its peers. It remains the key standard setter in many areas, and its knowledge and expertise are often crucial. Its seal of approval frequently encourages the participation of other donors or investors. So the bank does, in my view, still have a preeminent position. That position is being challenged by the emergence in 2015 of two new major multilateral development banks, the New Development Bank set up under the BRICS and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The World Bank has been depicted by some of its critics as being dominated by the United States and its allies. But the new banks, on the other hand, are being championed by China. The NDB presents itself officially on its website as an alternative to the existing US-dominated World Bank and IMF. Notwithstanding spirited denials by its leadership, the World Bank is under pressure to change in order to be able to compete more effectively with the new banks. And it's sometimes suggested this is one of the reasons why it's not keen to engage substantively with human rights. In a report that I'll be presenting next month to the UN General Assembly, I argue that the bank's policies on human rights are inconsistent and even incoherent. I argue, in fact, that the bank doesn't have a single human rights policy. It has quite a range of them, but in the area that counts most, which is its real project and program lending, the bank is actually a human rights-free zone. In its operational policies in particular, I say in my report, it treats human rights more like an infectious disease than universal values and obligations. The biggest single obstacle to moving forward to a more constructive approach is the anachronistic and inconsistent interpretation of the political prohibition contained in the Articles of Agreement of the bank. This 1945 document is interpreted as saying that the bank is unable to engage meaningfully with the international human rights framework or to assist member countries in complying with their own human rights obligations. That inhibits the bank's ability to take adequate account of the political economy aspects of its work within countries and contradicts and undermines the consistent recognition by the international community of the integral relationship between human rights and development. It also prevents the bank from putting into practice much of its own policy research and analysis, which actually points to the indispensability of certain human rights dimensions in many core development issues. In my view, the bank's current approach can be boiled down to the following propositions. A, pay lip service to human rights in official settings, because there are no consequences for doing that. B, acknowledge the theoretical significance of human rights in studies and analyses of issues in relation to which they are incontestably relevant. Gender equality, to give an example. C, ensure that, as a general rule, the bank does not engage with any aspect of human rights in its actual operations and lending. And D, be prepared to make exceptions when political imperatives require it, even if that involves a high level of inconsistency. I want to emphasize, despite the sort of stories that we've heard earlier today, which really obviously raise very major problems, that I believe the World Bank is an organization that has immense potential to do good in the world. I believe it has done immense good in the world in the past in many areas. I don't wish to denigrate it. I don't wish to tarnish its reputation. But I do believe firmly that the bank is effectively shooting itself in the foot by insisting on a policy approach that seeks to insulate itself from human rights standards and norms and acts as though these are matters that should be considered entirely independent of the bank's own work. The real challenge, of course, is to think constructively about how things might change. In my report to the UN next month, I canvass a number of recommendations. I'd like to recount those here, but to emphasize that they're directed more to the bank than to the US and especially to the Congress as such. The struggle for the integration of human rights into the work of the World Bank and other international financial institutions has been long and not always successful, but I have faith in the willingness and ability of this Congress to act on an issue that has such enormous implications for the future of development. In terms of the specific recommendations in my report, I argue, first of all, that the president of the bank needs to take the initiative in developing a coherent and consistent human rights policy. There are many options and paths that could reasonably be taken. The bank is a very special organization, and it will need a carefully tailored policy that takes adequate account of the many concerns that will certainly be expressed. Most of all, there needs to be a transparent discussion based on carefully thought through proposals. Next, the bank needs to remove the roadblock that has been erected by its anachronistic interpretation of the political prohibition in the Articles of Agreement. Just as the phrase economic considerations has been interpreted to allow bank measures to combat corruption and promote the rule of law and criminal justice reform, so too can that phrase, the emphasis on economic considerations, accommodate a human rights policy. The starting point for any policy is simply to acknowledge that human rights are relevant to the twin goals of the bank. Engagement with human rights experts and mechanisms should become routine. A good starting point would be for the Human Rights Council to invite the president of the bank to address it and engage in dialogue. The bank should have a human rights due diligence policy that spells out some of the circumstances under which it would be unable to continue providing support for a given project. The UN has such a policy. Another key principle in any bank policy should be to encourage and assist governments to meet their existing obligations. The bank already does that in the environmental area. In general, the policies of the bank should emphasize the ways in which it can provide positive support, advice, and assistance to states in relation to human rights. Bank policy should, in my view, also address economic, social, and cultural rights as human rights. Next, addressed to member countries, I think all member states need to begin to grapple seriously with what a human rights policy should look like, rather than simply saying they are for or against such a policy. We've got to start getting specific. Civil society, I think, needs to start to think through in a more systematic and nuanced way exactly what they would like to see from a human rights initiative. For me, it's debatable whether some of the roles that the bank has been called on to undertake in the past are appropriate. My general sense is that too much of the general policy of civil society towards the World Bank is driven by specific disaster stories. And that's not the best way to fix any ship. Just to point to the great holes that are there, one needs to look at the overall structure, make that stronger, and make sure that it doesn't generate those holes in the future. I think we need to move away from the emphasis on sanctions, which dominates too many of the debates around the World Bank. When sanctions are adopted, and I refer in my report to the controversial case about the response to draconian laws against LGBT people in Uganda, those policies are often, the response of the bank is often arbitrary and inconsistent, and in my view, counterproductive. As long as sanctions are considered to be the main element in a human rights policy, many governments will continue to resist progress in this area. And based on what's happened today, their position is not difficult to understand. Finally, I just emphasize, as I said before, that what the bank does is going to be very relevant in terms of the approach adopted by these new development banks that are coming onto the scene. So that is yet another reason why we need to pay more attention to trying to get the bank itself to develop a constructive human rights policy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate your testimony and the report as well. You know, the World Bank commits many billions of dollars per year on projects that are aimed to improve service delivery in borrowing countries, including in the areas of healthcare, education, and water and sanitation. The bank has often stated that it enhances the enjoyment of human rights of people in these countries because it works because they're improving access to goods and services, and more generally by lifting people out of poverty. So I guess my question is, why is it necessary for the bank to refer to the rights, refer the right to health, the right to education, or the right to water in the context of projects in those areas? In other words, if the bank is trying to do good by improving service delivery, why is there a need for a reference to a human rights framework?
So I think that's an excellent question. I think it's the leading question in a way. What difference does it make? And the bank will often say, look, you don't understand. Everything we do promotes human rights. We're on the same page. You just speak a different language from us. We're economists, you're lawyers, you get obsessed with this sort of language, so why does it make a difference? For me, it makes an enormous difference. I would take one of the areas that you've given, if you take, for example, education, which is an area, or water, areas in which the bank works very extensively, is the key player. It makes a huge difference if your policies are premised on the existence of a right to education versus a general policy that we will do our best to enhance opportunities. In this country, there is what I would characterize as right to education legislation in virtually every state constitution. The state shall provide education. It is therefore a right of the citizens. Much can flow from that. We wouldn't put up with a policy in the United States where where I live, the government of New York would say, we're going to do our darndest to provide good educational opportunities. We're going to have a huge number of programs, and that really should satisfy you. The state of New York has a right to education.
Donald Trump has said that, you know.
Well,
yeah.
bon courage, as they say in French, if that happens. But I think it does make a very big difference. It brings in an acknowledged framework. When we talk about the right to education, we know what we're talking about.
Right.
We've spelled that out in some detail. We're talking about obligations that each of these states have themselves voluntarily accepted. We're not talking about programs and projects that the bank is making up as it goes along. We are talking about programs in particular that recognize, and I'm sorry if I sound like an academic here, but recognize agency and autonomy. In other words, the individual is recognized as having the right and is thus empowered in some way. Even a girl living in a society where girls are not given access to education. If the starting premise for the government is that there is a right to education, that has its ways of trickling down through government agencies, through the community, and even into the family. Dad, I thought I had a right to education. Why can't I go to school? That is hugely empowering and vastly different from a technocratic approach where the bank comes in and says, we're very cognizant of all the problems you've got here. We've got the greatest experts in the world. We've studied it and we've come up with these programs. That's great, but also empower the people. Recognize that there is a right. Work with those governments to use that as your starting point.
So you teach international law and international human rights, and the World Bank has often invoked a legal argument to explain why it cannot integrate human rights into its operations. The World Bank's articles of agreement contain a so-called political prohibition that forbids the bank to interfere in the political affairs of its members and only allows it to take economic considerations into account. So that's what they say. And according to the World Bank, human rights fall outside of its mandate because they are, according to the bank, quote, political. And I'd like to get your view of that argument.
The starting point before I respond directly is, of course, to note that the bank has actually gone through various phases, and the current blanket interpretation that is applied is much more rigid, inflexible than was put forward even 20 years ago. So the starting point is the Articles of Agreement date from 1945, 70 years old. At that time, Lord Keynes and others were very keen to ensure that there would be a separation between the political and the economic. They particularly didn't want a bank that could only deal with governments of a particular political persuasion, so they put this in. Very quickly, the bank started to change dramatically in terms of its role from post-war reconstruction and quite limited development, economic development, into a wide range of areas. So today we see a bank that is involved in every aspect of society, basically. Along with that had to go a reinterpretation. The bank was only allowed to act in relation to issues which have some economic significance, taking account of economic considerations. So you get, for example, in 2012 to the area which had for a long time been a no-go zone, surprisingly, but not surprisingly in other ways, and that is the criminal justice system. In the past, we didn't want the bank, or the bank didn't want to be supporting, didn't want to get into those areas. It's very easy for you, as a dictator, to say, well, I'm just using the criminal justice system and it just happens to lock up all of my opponents. And so the bank says, oh, wow, we don't want to get into that. Right. Too dangerous. But by 2012, the writing was on the wall. It was very clear that a criminal justice system has a huge impact on the way in which a society is developing, on the capacity to deliver justice generally, and the bank simply put out a legal opinion that there are many ways in which criminal justice affects the functioning of the economy, but there are also limitations. So we can do a lot of projects in support, but there are also limits. And we're going to identify certain safety valves. If we think things are getting too political, if we think they're problematic, we're going to subject them to extra levels of scrutiny, and we reserve the right to say, no, we don't go down that road. With human rights, however, the bank has never deviated. That is almost the sole exception, apart from giving assistance to the military or intelligence or whatever. Human rights remains the only area that is apparently entirely political. And what they're doing is reflecting the position as it was, if you like, back at the height of the Cold War. In those days, human rights was political. And more importantly, the human rights regime, to use the legal term, was almost non-existent. Very few treaties, very few countries had ratified those treaties, very few institutions to uphold them, either internationally or domestically. Today, that's changed radically. There's a huge international human rights regime. Every country in the world has ratified quite a few of the treaties. Most of those countries have domestic human rights institutions. And for the bank to stand back and say, oh no, that's all just politics. These are not issues that we can look at, is just out of date.
What is the most we can expect from the World Bank's review of its existing safeguards process? I mean, do you expect this to move us toward the engagement with the human rights framework that you consider to be necessary, or?
Well, it's been very highly contested. The bank, that is the extent to which the new new safeguards framework will recognize human rights in any way, has been highly contested. The bank would point to a number of key member states and say they are the ones who are preventing this. They don't want it. When we have consultations, these countries push back. But one of the problems is, that, again, that the bank has provided no leadership, has not provided any indication of how constructively human rights could be incorporated. And the bank seems to have been very happy to settle for a common denominator which is extraordinarily low. So the current version of the safeguards reads as follows, the key statement in the vision statement area. The World Bank shares the aspirations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and helps its clients fulfill those aspirations. Did you know that the United States government has aspirations in the field of human rights? It doesn't, my friend. It has obligations.
Right.
But for the World Bank, these are suddenly all reduced to aspirations, and we share them. Nice guys. To help ensure development effectiveness, the World Bank intends to maintain, in a manner consistent with its Articles of Agreement, the promotion of such an approach in the design and implementation of the development projects that it supports. This is classic taking away with one hand what you've given with the other. In other words, yeah, we're going to take account of human rights, but subject to the Articles of Agreement. Yeah. But we've interpreted the Articles of Agreement unilaterally as forbidding us from taking account of human rights. So in other words, where things stand, these safeguards are an example of the bank as a human rights-free zone for me.
Yeah, you know, you know, listening to our previous panel and listening to you as well, and knowing what I know about the World Bank, it always has been a puzzlement to me why there's been such a reluctance to understand the importance of human rights in the success of what their investment may be. You know, I had a discussion the other day with some people on this USAID program called Feed the Future. And you know, investments in sustainable agricultural development in poor countries, and you know, one of the things they were saying is that, you know, it's a great idea, but you know, you got to, but it's more than just investing. You got to think about things like human rights. You have to think about things like land rights, because if we invest in a community, in a project to help, you know, people be able to, you know, grow things and sustain the community, only to have, once it gets up and running, to have somebody come in and say, I'm throwing you off the land, I own it, then it's a big waste of money. It all falls apart. And so that these things really, you can't compartmentalize human rights when it comes to you know, investing in projects or in communities, because it's an important part of whether they're going to be successful. Those people in Kosovo who are being displaced, you know, without getting reparations, I mean, yeah, you may be building a coal plant at the end of the day, but look at all the destruction and poverty you left in the wake. And you know, whether it's in Ethiopia or whether it's in Peru, I mean, it's just, I mean, and again, I'm not a banker, but if you know, but I know a little bit about development, and it's supposed to be about lifting everybody up, not just, you know, and not putting people down. And so it's just always been kind of a puzzle to me that there's been such a reluctance. And I also think that, you know, countries right now in the world that are in upheaval are countries where rights are not respected. I mean, it ultimately leads to instability. And if I'm a bank, I'm investing in something, I want it to be in something that will be there for a long, long time, that it's a stable investment. But which brings me kind of to my last question. You know, how do we influence this process in a way where, you know, we can encourage the kind of change that we all want? And so from your knowledge, I think what would maybe one or two specific steps that the U.S. Congress could take to encourage the bank to incorporate human rights into its operational standards? I mean, what would be useful for us to do up here that might move us toward the goal that we share here?
Can I make a very quick comment first on the earlier part of your analysis, which I, of course, agree with very strongly. One of the great ironies, in a way, and I was talking to a journalist about this earlier, is that the private sector is increasingly moving to acknowledge the relevance of human rights to what they are doing. They, of course, are resisting taking on major human rights obligations because they're corporations, but for reasons of prudence, for reasons of good management and so on, they are increasingly taking account of human rights, engaging in the human rights framework, endorsing the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, and so on. We turn to the bank, and the bank does what any good banker should do and emphasizes in all of its policies the notion of risk management. We have to manage risks. Now, one would have thought that the best way to manage some risks is to factor human rights considerations into the design of the program, of the project. But because the bank has this almost ideological position that it can take no account of human rights, it's not able to do that. And so I think you can read many of its evaluation reports, which criticize the way in which it's actually done business, as acknowledging, but without saying it, that if there had been a broader notion of risk management that explicitly took account of human rights dimensions, you would get better development outcomes from the bank's policies.
This is good business, what we're talking
Yeah.
about here. This is, not just we all have a moral obligation to, uphold human rights. It's smart. It's a smart business practice
Right.
to do this.
I mean, it's like a domestic banker. I walk in off the street and the guy wants to know everything about me, but he doesn't probably, if he can break through privacy considerations, he doesn't just want to know that I've got a certain amount of money in the bank. He wants to know if I've got a reputation as an alcoholic, a reputation as an abusive employer or whatever, because that's going to make a difference. So if a country walks in off the street and it has a very bad record in terms of suppressing all freedom of expression and so on, I don't advocate myself that the bank should say, sorry, get out of here, we don't deal with you because you're a bad guy. I think the bank would be turning away the great majority of its clients if it was to take that approach. But what the bank should do, in my view, is to say, you've got a pretty bad record in terms of press freedom, in terms of freedom of association. So the question is, how can I develop or shape this particular project and program in such a way that it's not simply going to fail because there's no real feedback, there's no participation by the community and so on. So, give me some suggestions of how we can get around that issue, because otherwise, as I look at the environment in which this investment would be required, it's going to fail.
Right.
So back to the US Congress, I would like to come back to you, I think, with perhaps more elaborate suggestions, if it's not too late at some stage, but my general sense, and I don't know how to formulate this, as I said earlier, I think that there needs to be a strong encouragement for the bank to develop a constructive and nuanced human rights policy that would permeate all of its operations. And by that, I don't mean a rigid, inflexible policy that calls for it to withdraw from investments and withdraw from countries. I mean a constructive and nuanced policy that enables it to work out where taking account of human rights considerations can best promote the objectives that it's working towards, can best facilitate its efforts, and ideally be employed right at the outset.
Right.
And so when I sit and listen to these disaster stories that are presented to us earlier, I ask myself, if this had been a more effective upfront process, where going into the original design phase involved looking at the potential human rights risks, looking at the potential ways human rights could mitigate, perhaps you would have had a much better outcome. And the second thing I wonder about, the United States has played a very positive role in the past in relation to IDA replenishment debates. In the IDA context, the countries of the North that are the contributors have a particular role and responsibility. The United States has ensured that in the last 2 rounds of IDA, there has been a strong focus on gender equality and on climate change, and I think that's been very productive. There's a new IDA replenishment debate coming up, 18, and I think it would be very appropriate if human rights were to be the theme there. I'd be happy to try to work with representatives of this committee or of the Congress generally, and even with the World Bank to work out or to discuss what that might look like.
That would be helpful, because I think what you know, again, not being an expert on you know, what the appropriate language would be, because I agree with you. I mean, it has to be somewhat nuanced. I mean, you know, can't be rigid to the point that it's unworkable. But as I'm listening to the stories on the previous panel, I mean, you had 5 people killed in Peru, you know, as they were talking about this project, and I'm just curious, where does that fit into the calculation as to whether or not a project will be funded, you know, or the displacement of people, you know, or you know or a government crackdown on people. You know, there has to be, and that's what I was asking the previous panel. Sometimes I wonder whether the conversation is too much between the bank and the government, and not enough between the bank, the government, and civil society, or the people who live in the neighborhood, or the people who are going to be directly affected by the project. But you know, I would love to stay in touch with you about, you know, appeals that we can make directly to the bank, and about, you know, potential legislative fixes or ideas that that might help, you know, kind of move us in a direction that's more constructive. And but I think your point about it has to be carefully designed so that we don't basically make it impossible for the bank to do business with any country in the world, including our own. You know, look at, I always tell people, you know, the United States, we're not perfect. Some of my colleagues
would contest that.
Contest that, but we're not. Even on the human right, and even in our own development policies, you know, I mean, there sometimes I think human rights issues get put aside more for, you know, strategic and, you know, security, you know, considerations, and I regret that very much, because I think, you know, whatever short-term gain you get, in the long term you lose. But you know, having been on this commission now for several years, issues about the bank and human rights have come up repeatedly, you know, and I think a lot of us on this commission would just like to figure out a constructive way to kind of move the human rights agenda along, you know, in a way that would be beneficial to a lot of the people that we heard here today, and, you know, a lot of the concerns that have been raised. So we will definitely stay in touch.
Thank you, Congressman. I think
thank you
the
very
Commission
much
plays
for
a
your
very important
patience
role.
and for your testimony, and I appreciate it, and look forward to working with you. So this hearing has come to a conclusion. Thank you.